welcome again to our second session. For today, we will be talking about perception. What you see is what you get, particularly at interpersonal context or level. Before we go deep into the lecture, have you ever looked at a picture of anything, say your picture, and interpreted that picture to mean one thing for you? And you ask your friend to look at the very same picture and they see something completely different than you did? Or even perhaps you say something to a loved one and they took it in a way that you could have never expected them to take it. So what does that tell us? That is the world of perception, that people interpret similar things in a completely different ways, million ways. So this chapter will look at perception on an interpersonal level. You're gonna learn in this chapter the process of perception, looking messages at selecting, organizing, and interpreting. We will also talk about influences of perception, the accuracy and the inaccuracy of perception. And finally, the most useful skills from this topic will be using perception checks to prevent misunderstanding and conflicts. So, by the end of this lesson, students will be able to describe how perception is formed, list factors that influence our perception, what are the elements of perception check, and finally, students will be able to develop and write a response to scenarios by using perception check tools. So, what is a perception? Can anyone guess? Okay, perception is a process of creating meanings for things, situations, symbols, and phenomena. And how are we creating those meanings? We are creating those meanings to the objects, to the phenomena, to the situations by selecting, organizing, and interpreting. And those are the process of perception. The first process of perception is selection. We select to attend certain stimuli based on certain factors. Or sometimes we choose to ignore the stimuli. There are factors that make us to attend certain stimuli. For example, the intensity of the stimuli. For example, loud music. If it's too loud, because of that intensity, we select that stimuli. We will select it. Or the expectation. For example, things we see every day become normal, such that we don't care at all. But if something unexpected or unusual happens, we tend to select it. We tend to attend. We present ourselves. So that is a selection. There are other factors that influence our selection process. Some of the factors include the motivation. For example, opposite sex matter each other or they are attracted to each other, so that we pay attention to their looks, appearance, and their clothing. So that we pay attention to their looks, appearance, and their clothing. Okay, when I select something, I need to organize it, and we call the organization process of perception. It involves arranging of data in a meaningful way through perceptual schema. Perceptual schema is a cognitive framework that allows us to organize the raw data that we selected according to the appearance, the social roles, the interaction styles, the psychological traits, and the memberships. After organizing, the idea of stereotyping will come into existence. Because we organize, we group things to make a meaningful thing, and that is stereotyping. It is exaggeration or generalization associated with categorizing the system. For example, those two women, that the one on the right, you can see we can call it lazy, she's giving, she's insecure, she's passive. And you can see the one on the left, we call it superficial, ambitious, she's confident, and so on and so forth. So during the organization process of perception, we create stereotypes. So we talk about selecting, organizing. Let us talk about interpretation now. Once we select and categorize things happening around us, we still have to interpret it and assign meaning to it. Remember, it's us human beings that assign meanings. And how are we assigning meanings? There are several factors that affect our interpretation. To begin with, the degree of involvement affects our interpretation. How much we involve, how much relationships we have. So we tend to favor with those people that we have relationship than those people that we don't have. The personal experience, the interactions you had with the previous people affects your interpretation. If you have never talked to someone before, then it's your first time and you might be fearing or you might be scared of them because you never had experience. Or sometimes you had a bad experience or with your instructor or maybe with your landlord, then you will interpret anything coming according to the past experiences. Attitudes. Our attitude shapes the way we make sense to other behaviors. Expectation. The anticipation shapes the interpretation. If you are told in advance that an instructor was terrific, will it affect how you perceive the teacher? Self-concept. The world sees differently when you are feeling insecure than when you are feeling secure. And then the knowledge, lastly. How much you knew about the thing or how much knowledge you have. Okay, fun scenario. Mike might give an example of different perception of the world's most famous class. It's called Mike Might class. So as you can see from the class here, someone is measuring how much the class is full, and the other one is measuring how much the class is empty. That is showing us that the optimist is thinking the class is half full, which is this one. And the pessimist is thinking that the class is half empty. What about the salesperson? The salesperson will think, how much water would you like your class to hold? How about the accountant? The accountant will say, does the class really need all that water? How about investment banker? They will say, I'm only 50% leverage. And finally, the engineers. The engineers will say the class is twice as big as it needed to be. Influences on perceptions. How we select, organize, and interpret information is influenced by several factors, including the physiological influences. Physiological influences. Each of us perceive the world differently because of the physiological factors, such as the sense, age, health, fatigue, and hunger. In physiological processes, for example, the sense matters a lot. And when we say sense, it includes how each one of us sees, hear, taste, touch, and smell things. Have you ever been told by your roommate to turn down the radio because it makes him go deaf? And you replied, It's not too loud. If I turn it down, it will be impossible to hear it. Look how those two people are different. Your roommate is thinking that the music can make him go deaf, but you're talking about if you turn it down, it will be impossible to hear it. So that's something to do with the physiological processes. Another factor that influence on perception is cultural differences. Every culture has its own way of looking at the world. Sometimes problems arise out of poor translation from one language to another language. And this also includes the nonverbal behaviors, because different cultures have different meanings to nonverbal behaviors. An example of cultural differences: in Asian culture, expression of thoughts and feelings is discouraged, and silence is valued, while in North America it is the opposite to that. Some of the influence on perception also include social roles. Social roles can also cause communication breakdown. From the time we were born, we were indirectly taught as a set of rules that we expected to play. Prescribed roles help society to function smoothly and help us to know what we are expected to do, so we will not fall into trouble. Another factor includes gender roles. Research shows that males and females do perceive the world differently for reasons including their genetic makeup and their hormones. Gender roles are socially approved ways that men and women are expected to behave. And finally, occupation roles can influence the perception. Even our jobs can influence how we perceive things. For example, the police, how they see things is differently from how a regular person sees the world. Okay, so we talked about how perception is formed, influences on perception, and let us now discuss about common tendencies in perception, the accuracy and the inaccuracy. We attribute meaning to our own actions and to the actions of others, but we do it differently. That's very funny. So how do we do it? Number one, we charge ourselves more generously, and this tendency is called self-serving bias. For example, when others suffer, we somehow think that it is their fault, but when we suffer, we think that we are the victims, and this is due to the fact that we judge ourselves more generously. We label people according to their first impressions in order to make interpretations about them. You may hear someone say, "He seems sincere." How do they know? They're just clinging to the first impression. Or you may hear, "They sound awfully conceited." Those are all about clinging to the first impression. And finally, we tend to assume that others are similar to us, but that's not always true. Okay, we come to the last section of the session today. That's perception checking. Perception checking is really important. Please pay attention to this section. It's a very useful skill. Perception checking is a tool for helping you to understand others accurately instead of assuming that your first interpretation is correct. Serious problems can arise when people treat interpretation as if they were true. Like most people, you probably resent others jumping to conclusions about your behaviors. The skills of perception checking provide a better way to handle your interpretation. So, what does perception check include? There are 4 elements that every perception check should have. The first element is a description of the behavior you noted. You have to describe the behavior, clearly describe it. At least 2 possible interpretations of the behavior. Make sure that your interpretations are relevant to the behavior, not just vague things. A request for clarification about how you interpret. Then you ask about your colleagues or whoever you are talking to. You request that they clarify about your interpretation. Let us practice let's practice some perception checking using the elements that we discussed for perception check. The scenario is, I'm upset because my friend Anna canceled plans we had for months at the last minute. So let's follow the 4 processes we mentioned, or the 3 processes we mentioned. Let us apply the elements of perception. So the 3 steps of perception check is, Anna, you canceled the plan with me on Friday, and that's a clear description of the behavior. Either you were mad at me or you did not feel like going. These are the 2 possible interpretations. They are both related and they are relevant to the topic. Either you were mad at me, that's the interpretation 1, or you did not feel like going, that's the interpretation 2. And then what's the last step? You ask for clarification. What was your reason for canceling the last minute? So that's a perception check. Instead of you confronting with your friend and concluding that he just cancelled the plans for no reason, it's better you follow these 3 steps by first of all describing clearly about the behavior, provide 2 possible interpretations, and ask for clarifications. Okay, let's practice another scenario. Yesterday you saw your friend Terry walking in the UV garden with Casey, a recent date of yours. They seem to be engaged in an intense conversation. So I would like you to apply the perception check we recently talked about to this scenario and come up with an answer. I will give you some minutes and then we can review together. Okay, I hope you wrote down your answer somewhere. Let's practice the 3 steps of perception check to this scenario. The first step was describe clearly about the behavior. And this is how it goes. When I saw you yesterday in the UV Infinity Garden with Casey, I didn't know what to think. And then we provide interpretation. I thought that you might be talking about that class you were taking together. That's interpretation 2. But I was also wondering if you're interested in dating Casey. That's interpretation 2. And this is the last part, which is you seek for clarification. Are you interested in Casey as a friend or as a date? That's how easy it is. So the 3 steps of perception check is clearly describe the behavior, come up with 2 possible interpretations, and ask for clarification. I hope you understood clearly about how to apply perception check to avoid misunderstanding. Okay, I will give you these 3 more scenarios to do in your homework, and then we will discuss later on. So we come to the conclusion of the lesson. We discuss about the process of perception. We talk about selecting process, organization, and the interpretation. We also talk about the influences of perception, including gender roles, the physiological factors, and so on. We also talk about the accuracy and the inaccuracy of perception. And finally, and the most important thing we learned was perception check, using perception check to prevent misunderstanding. That's all about perception. I know it was a very long chapter. If you have questions, you can always contact me from my email, italy@uvic.ca. Questions and comments are all welcome. Thank you.